Hi everyone, Professor King here. Today we'll be discussing chapter 9 of Lunsford's Everything is an Argument, which goes over arguments of definition. So I'm going to put it on the share screen as normal, as usual, and post the PowerPoint. Again, you can feel free to copy as you go, pause where needed, and if you have any questions, please message me with any and all of them. So I'll take it to the share screen now and I'll pull up the PowerPoint. So chapter 9 talks about arguments of definition. And some of you may be thinking, well, definitions are definitions. What's the argument? And the thing is there are very definite and specific arguments. And I can show you some very contemporary examples of what they are and why they are relevant and important. So first of all, what are arguments of definition? Well, and what do they do? They wield the power to say what something can or cannot be. And that is incredibly important because sometimes when new terms come into our lexicon, when new terms come into our vocabulary, they change not only how we address a certain person or subject, but they also change how we see the world. And that is incredibly powerful. So we can't think of definitions as these benign things. They have a lot of power embedded in them. Arguments of definition are not abstract exercises. They often concern hotly debated issues with major stakes involved. And they can be exclusive or inclusive, meaning, depending on the terms we use, we are excluding some groups and we are including others based on how we are defining things. If you've ever played the game 20Q, the little like electronic ball where it asks you like animal, mineral, or vegetable, and then you say animal, and then it excludes then everything that's not a mineral or vegetable, and then it just includes or focuses on anything that could be an animal. And then it kind of keeps asking you questions from there, and then hopefully it gets to the animal that you were thinking of in your head. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about definition and categorization, right? Like once you define or categorize something, by very nature of that thing being defined, that means that everything within it, right, is in that category or definition, and everything outside of it is excluded from that. And since language is dynamic, meaning that language is always changing, the meanings of political, social, and scientific terms are constantly re-argued, constantly reshaped, and constantly updated. So let's use a really contemporary term that has only been in usage widely for maybe the past 10 or 20 years, and that is the term transgender. Before that, there was no term to identify clearly and explicitly what we're talking about when we are talking about people who are transgender, right? The previous vocabulary that we had was limiting, right? It wasn't correct. It wasn't exact. Words like transvestite, which literally means someone who dresses, and only talking about dressing, right, as the opposite or polar opposite gender, I should say, because gender is a spectrum, right? We have poles on either end. Transgender cross-dresser was another, really cringy one. Transvestite, these are terms that we would not use anymore because they would be considered not only offensive, but they're incredibly outdated, right? So when we talk about transgender, right, that term is much more appropriate and effective, because if gender is a preference, right, if gender is a spectrum, then we're not talking necessarily about someone changing the chromosomes that they were born with, which can be, again, a spectrum, any number of things. But we're talking about the gender preference, right, and the expression of that and what that looks like. But also when we talk about transgender people, right, or people who are transgender, if we're thinking in that old, outdated gender binary model of anyone can only be a man or only be a woman, then we're not allowing for complexity, right? We're not allowing for all of the other gender expressions that fall on the spectrum. And that's problematic. And the reason why that's problematic is because, again, it excludes a large swath of people who may be gender nonconforming, gender non-binary, gender fluid, transgender, agender, right? And any and all other expressions along the gender spectrum. And so if I am gender nonconforming and someone tells me, no, you are a woman, right? I'm not. And to be categorized into that realm is a miscategorization. And you may say, well, yeah, what's the big deal? Like, you know, I don't mean to minimize it or again, come off as glib, but, you know, someone might say like, well, yeah, what's the big deal? Like, just dress differently, right? No, right? There are all of these political implications involved, right? That's why we are seeing such a social pandemic of particularly transgender women of color who are being murdered at an alarmingly high rate, 4 times the rate of cisgender women. That's why we're seeing things like this human rights campaign. Where'd you go? Human rights campaign, Human Rights Watch article about how now healthcare providers are allowed to discriminate against LGBTQ people on the basis of what is called personal beliefs, right? So in other words, if I belong to a sort of very rigid, very fundamentalist worldview, and I say that transgender people are an abomination, and I'm a doctor, Trump just literally like passed legal legislation saying that I can discriminate against those people. And the problem with that is doctors, when they become doctors, take an oath to ensure that, you know, they are not doing harm, that they are providing comfort and relief to as many people as possible, regardless of who those people are and where they come from. And so that's, again, why these definitions become incredibly major, right? What they have so much gravitas and importance. So how do we begin an argument of definition? Well, we have to start categorizing, right? We have to think of what falls between what defines and what does not define an issue or a term. But we have to also construct a definition that is as rich enough as it can be to cover all perspectives. So, you know, again, if I think of a word like woman, this is rife with, it's like a minefield of terms, right? If you think about what defines a woman, because the second you say one thing, there are going to be, you know, thousands of contradictions to that example that still define woman, right? If I say like someone with long hair, well, there are plenty of women with short hair, right? If I say someone with a certain set of genitalia, well, again, women have all kinds of genitalia. If I say someone who can have kids, that knocks out anyone who has gone through menopause, who's had a hysterectomy, who deals with infertility, right? So we have to be very deliberate and very careful when we think about these definitions, because the second we think we've defined it, those groups that we're excluding, they become those members of our audience that we are alienating, right? That we are painting with a broad brush, and that we are therefore going to lose. And not just lose, you know, that shouldn't be our end goal, right? To keep as many audience members. It should be, again, to find that commonality, to find that common ground, to respect one another. And when we paint with a broad brush, when we don't consider complexity, a lot of times, intentionally or not, we fall into those pitfalls of excluding people and thereby disrespecting them in ways that we should not. So that's why, again, these arguments of definition are so important, and the acknowledgement of the complexity of the terms is so important, right? As we talked about with chapter 5, we want to stay out of either or fallacies. We want to stay out of black or white thinking. We have to think in incredibly complicated and complex terms now. It's not just yes or no. It's not just good or bad, right? It's a spectrum of any and all sort of viewpoints. It's a radar, right? Where we could fall anywhere on that radar. It's much more complicated than we think. So how do we not begin an argument of definition? Well, don't just grab a dictionary and say, here, blah. Dictionaries are time sensitive and they're culturally sensitive. And also it's lazy writing. You know, the person who, again, as I've said before in the visual map video, I hate hooks. They annoy me, they're useless, they're pointless, right? Put them in the conclusion if you're gonna put them anywhere. But inevitably, I will get at least, I don't know, 2 or 3 essays a semester that begin their hook, right, with a definition, right? The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines X as blah, blah, blah. Well, first of all, think about that. You are talking to an audience that has a master's degree in English literature, right? I know dictionary definitions. I know what they mean. That was a large part of my education, right? So that's one misstep, right? But also, the dictionary definition is usually not going to provide that complexity of the term as you need to define it. And again, because language is dynamic and changing and new words come into the lexicon all the time, we can't rely on dictionaries, because a lot of times the dictionaries we're using are old and outdated and aren't keeping up with these trends, right? And I'll pull up, I'm gonna take it off share screen for just a sec so I can pull up the example I'm talking about. One example that's very, very recent in the news is, you know, with the renewed interest in you know, things like Black Lives Matter and police brutality. I believe it was a woman who was looking up racism in the Merriam-Webster dictionary. A Missouri woman asked Merriam-Webster to update its definition. Okay, so let me pull up this source right here. And, you know, granted, it is CNN, but I promise you this was an actual, you know, news item recently. And so I'm gonna put it back on share screen to show you this article here. Oh gosh, all these ads. AARP. I mean, I'm almost there, but I'm not there yet. Anyway. Okay, so here we have I'll skip the video, right? But I just want to show you kind of what's going on here, right? That a woman, this is the date of this is June 12th. So this is incredibly recent, right? And this woman, Kennedy Mitchum, let Merriam-Webster know that their definition of racism, as it was in the dictionary for years and years and years and years and years, was inadequate, right? And she writes, you know, in this cultural zeitgeist, this post George Floyd death cultural zeitgeist, she's saying, hey, you know, your definition of racism is not fitting the current day, is not fitting 2020, right? It's not representative of what's actually happening in the world, right? And so here, I'll scroll down. If you see here, it says Merriam-Webster's first definition of racism is a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Well, we all know what race that is, but it was never made explicit, right? And so she emailed them, and they changed it. They changed it. So they talked about how they're expressing it more clearly, right? And how they're going to change the definition, right? Let's see, where does it? So they're going to, you know, kind of look at this, right? A doctrine or political program based on the assumption of racism to design and execute its principles, a political or social system founded on racism, which would cover systemic racism and oppression. And that was kind of the thing, right? So I'll take it off this article, but think about that, right? Think about how incredibly powerful that is. That if you would have defined racism in your essay up to June 12th, which at the time of this recording was only less than 2 weeks ago, you would have had the wrong definition. You know, it wouldn't have been culturally and chronologically accurate for the times we're living in right now. And so that's why these definitions and understanding them as current and as complicated as they can be is so important. So what kinds of definitions do we have? Well, we have formal, operational, and definitions by example. Formal definitions I already talked about, which is like what we find in dictionaries, right? Where they talk about kind of breaking it down into like, you know, if you think about like the animal kingdom, like kingdom, phylum, class, order, genera, species, like we're just breaking it down into further and further categories to make it as specific as possible. But every time we do that, right, every time we go kingdom, phylum, class, order, genera, species, right, then we're excluding all those things that don't belong to those categories. So in doing that, we're identifying those features or criteria that make these, and that make all of this outside of them something else, right? Like the 20 questions game. And this is what it looks like if you've never played it. It's pretty fun, especially if like you go on a road trip or something and you're just bored out of your mind and you want to ignore everyone and all of your iPhone games have like been played to the limit, right? Pull this baby out and just, you know, have some fun. The next one is operational definitions, where you identify an object or idea by what it does or what conditions create it, right? So like a lot of times when we think about like a lot of mechanical or definitions or things that involve like actually doing stuff, like where people who work on cars or people who you know, put together chemical compounds, or people who are chefs, right? Like these objects or ideas, like think of like a yeast starter, right? Everyone's baking bread in the quarantine, and so everyone's talking about yeast starters. Well, that's an operational definition, right? A yeast starter is literally something that gets your bread to be able to bake, right? The yeast to create dough. So that's an operational definition, right? But there are any number of operational definitions we can talk about. And then we have definitions by example. You define a class by listing its individual members, right? So like if I were to say, define punk rock bands by example, then you would like give me a list of all the punk rock bands that you consider to be in the genre of punk rock, right? Horror films, right? Why is Get Out a horror film, right? In some ways it defies that genre, but in other ways it conforms to that genre. The English literary canon is a great example for those of you who are English majors. There's no sort of like set rules or guidelines of what constitutes the English literary canon. No one came, you know, no one stepped up one day and said, okay, this is what's going to create a horror film, but this is not. This is what's going to create something that gets into the literary canon, and this is what is not. We just kind of know, right? Because we have those certain criteria, those of us who are in these subgroups, right? We have those criteria to define by example because we are so aware of that culture and what constitutes it. So when you formulate claims, right, you can start with tentative claims, which means they're declarative statements that represent your first response to a rhetorical situation. So just like you have a working thesis, in your body paragraphs, you'll have tentative claims, meaning the more research you do, the more ideas come to mind, the more revision you do, those should be clarified, streamlined, revised, etc. as you continue your writing process. Making a claim of definition is just the starting point to the argument, right? So I love it. I love it. love it. I love it when students email me like a week before an essay is due and go, I finished the essay. No, you didn't. Do you know how many more times you could revise that thing? You could perfect it. You could make it even more crystal clear and uniquely yours. I mean, like I said, Hemingway rewrote A Clean, Well-Lighted Place 22 times before he ever even submitted it for publication. And guess what he said after he published it? He wished he would have revised it more, right? So, in other words, if you just write one draft, sorry, that's coleslaw, that's my dog. If you just, coleslaw, hey, if you just write one draft and you think you're done, you are only at the beginning, all right? So keep that in mind. And know that statements or claims of definition aren't arguments until they're attached to reasons, data, claims, evidence. In other words, you can't just go around saying like, here's the definition. You have to show why it is, right? You have to prove every argument that you're making. So you have to provide that evidence. When you're crafting definitions, make sure you and your reader are on the same page. How I define a woman might be different than how you define a woman. So you want to make sure that you make that clear enough to where, again, you have that mutual understanding, that mutual respect, and you say, here is how, if I'm going to argue X about women, here is how I am defining women, right? So that you and I are on the same page. And you investigate your subject. Again, especially the stuff you agree with. Interrogate it, critique it, defend every part of your definition, anticipate counterarguments and naysayers, because the best way you can strengthen your argument, and more specifically your argument of definition, is if you anticipate people who are going to go, but what about this? But what about that? I don't agree with that, right? If you can have answers for that, and again, make all of those qualifiers for all of those different viewpoints, you're solid gold, right? Like, but if you just say, here's my definition, and you never think about how people are going to respond to it, you are just opening out yourself up for any number of attacks. So you have to anticipate counter arguments and naysayers. I think, yeah, this is the last page. So when you match your claims to your definitions, make sure your subject fits your definition. Consider the following, right? The subject is a clear example of the class being defined, or it falls out of the designated class, right? If we think about how cruelly, how absolutely horribly trans people have been treated in our very recent history, right? If you watch the film Disclosure that just came out, this will provide you great examples of this argument of definition. You know, if someone who is ignorant to the trans experience looks at a trans woman and says, but you're clearly a man, right? That person with their limited understanding of the trans experience believes that genitalia or just assumed genitalia, right? We don't know, no, we're not, most of us aren't walking around naked, letting it flop about. That person believes that subject to fall out of the defined class because of their ignorance. But then let's say that person who says, oh, you're really a man, goes and actually does some research and actually understands what the trans experience is like and actually educates himself. And then he finds out, oh, gender is actually a spectrum of expression. You are clearly a woman because you have all of these markers of being a woman and you ask to be referred to as a woman, you are a woman. Then that person, having been educated, one, realizes the complexity, right, of the subject matter, but also realizes that it does fall into the contemporary, current, relevant definition, defined class of what it means to be a woman. But make sure your definition also falls between two closely related classes, fulfills some conditions of the definition, but not others. Again, complexity is the key here. And think of the term, if the term requires a new definition because it defies existing classification or categorization, right? A great example that I like to think of is the term intersectionality that's being bandied about a lot, but that term's actually existed for about over 30 years. Famous sociologist by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term in 1989 in her work on looking at how different identity markers and different markers of oppression intersect, right? So in other words, if I am a woman, right, as a white woman, I experience different privileges than a woman of color, right? That woman of color, because she has two identity markers, two markers of oppression, is going to face more struggle than I will. And I will be blind, right, to certain struggles that she faces because of my white privilege. So all that is to say that Kimberly Crenshaw created this term intersectionality because we were looking at categories of race and gender, et cetera, separately. And that was creating a lot of problems for us because it wasn't accurately defining the issues that certain groups with multiple identity markers were facing. So she created that new term. It defied existing classification and categorization, but guess what? It created a new level of classification and categorization that made these discussions for these groups much more relevant, much more pertinent, much more accurate. And always make sure to modify your claim as new evidence emerges, right? Think about the term African American, right? Before African American, we had Negro. Before Negro, we had colored people. Before that, we had, you know, any number of terms. And as society is changing, and as, you know, hopefully we start treating people of African descent in this country better, those terms have much more respect, right, and much more nuance to them than just, you know, some of these older terms that are offensive and outdated. So I'm going to take it off share screen. I hope that, again, when we think about arguments of definition, we have to understand how incredibly impactful and important they are and how they're constantly changing, right? In your lifetime, I promise you, you will utilize a word that will be changed and will be redefined and will be re-understood. You know, and I don't know what that is. I don't have a crystal ball in front of me, but I promise you it will happen. So these arguments of definition, like I said, they're very powerful. They change culture in small and big ways. So take them seriously, right? And use them with that understanding of complexity and nuance and respect that any good rhetor, any good arguer would do. Well, I hope this was helpful, and I hope this made sense. If not, you know, message me. But I also hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you all later.